In the past half century, many countries have been transformed by sweeping demographic change, which shows no signs of diminishing. Around the globe, fertility rates have fallen precipitously, family sizes have contracted, populations have stabilized or contracted. We are still coming to terms with the many ramifications of that change, which echo through economic, social, political, and cultural life. For all the discussions of the issue, one critical area remains largely neglected, and that is religion and religious behavior. There is a direct relationship that exists between the fertility rates of a community and that society's degree of religious fervor and commitment. High fertility societies tend to be fervent, devout, and religiously enthusiastic. Conversely, the lower the fertility rate, the smaller family size, the greater the tendency to detach from organized or institutional religion. Fertility rates provide an effective gauge for religious behavior and commitment, and rapid changes should serve as an alarm bell about incipient secularization and the decline of institutional religion. Hello, my name is James Ungarianu, and welcome again to Confronting History, a George L. Mosse program in history webinar. Today, I'm thrilled to have on the show distinguished professor of history at Baylor University, Philip Jenkins. Philip Jenkins is a prolific author. His latest book, which I just quoted, is Fertility and Faith, the Demographic Revolution and the Transformation of World Religion, published in 2020 by Baylor University Press. But if I may say so, Professor Jenkins has written over 20 books addressing a truly staggering range of topics. Some of my favorite have been Hidden Gospels, How the Search for Jesus Lost Its Way, published in 2002. Perhaps most well known is his next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, also published in 2002, and God's Continent, Christianity, Islam, and Europe's Religious Crisis, published in 2007. Another highlight, in my opinion, is his Jesus Wars, how 4 patriarchs, 3 queens, and 2 emperors decided what Christians would believe for the next 1,500 years. And that was published in 2010. So I'm really excited to have him on the show to discuss his most recent scholarly undertaking. Welcome, Professor Jenkins. How are you?
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here.
Okay, great. Let's begin. As it were, at the beginning. If you will, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and how and why did you become a professor?
Yeah, I grew up in Wales. I did all my degrees at Cambridge University. And really, history was always kind of a passion for me. It was always the way I approached things. And it just seemed a very natural segue to go from through the various degrees and to being a professor. The exact discipline was a little bit up for grabs, partly decided by the opportunities at any given time. But history was always the organizing principle.
So were there any books or particular books that were formative in your time as a student?
You know, I could answer that in a couple of different ways. In terms of academic books, you know, I can think of a couple, but the books that were obsessing me at the time were a very different kind of book, much more literature and fantasy. I was reading a lot of J.G. Ballard from very early years, and that would be very high on my list.
Okay. So thank you for sharing that. So the book in question is Fertility and Faith, the Demographic Revolution and the Transformation of World Religion. Lots of stuff to talk about. But first, I think for anyone is this question of why this topic? What was its inspiration?
Sure.
When did you start thinking about this correlation? Was it connected to any of your earlier work?
Yeah, I always say that each of my books grows out of an earlier book, even if it's only like a line in that earlier book. I published that book, Connects Christendom, back in 2002. I was doing a lot of lecturing on that. And I started coming across this issue of fertility rates in very surprising ways. So, for example, I was looking at the Middle East. I was looking at Iran. I did an article in New Republic back in 2006.
Hmm.
And just kept finding these really strange correlations between the two, between fertility and faith. And it became a great analytical tool that I was returning to all the time. So it just seemed very natural to write a book. In fact, the big question is not so much why I wrote it in 2020, is why I didn't write it 5 or 8 years earlier, because
Yeah.
the material was gathering. And as you said, I mean, it's just not a topic that anyone has really worked on. So I felt I had something new to say.
Yeah, great. So uh, you begin the book by discussing the steep declines in fertility rates in Europe,
Right.
Europe's revolution, as you put it. What was the baby bust? You use that phrase, the baby bust in the beginning of the book. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're, we're all familiar with the baby boom, which is the idea of lots of children, very high fertility rates. Europe had a couple of baby busts when
Mm,
fertility rates went into sharp decline. One very interesting one, which is understudied, and who knows, that's the next book, is in the 1920s and 1930s. Then everyone goes off to war, and as they come back from the war in 1945, they start begetting children in very large numbers, and that
mm,
echoes through the whole system. So schools get very crowded. That's a big issue for businesses, for manufacturers, for entertainment, for popular culture. We know about these vast markets in the 50s and 60s. And then that kind of went into reverse from about 1963, seems to be the turning point.
mm.
And everything I just said, turn it upside down, and you've got a pretty uh, good account. You take children and young people out of the picture. Now, so far, that's a story that is pretty familiar. But what was interesting for me is it also correlates so well with religion. The
Mm.
baby boom era is also the era of the greatest, most active institutional religiosity we've known in centuries. And when the bust comes, religion busts with it. And as you say, Europe is where that hits in a big way in the
Mm.
60s and 70s, and certainly deteriorates from there.
Yeah, you're right that World War One caused this massive disruption in family life, and
Right.
when things settled down, couples once again faced this kind of powerful social pressures of to reproduce. And you say this baby boom had this kind of cascading effect through
Yep.
society, politics, economy, and then. But this baby boom, somewhat ironically, resulted in a kind of powerful youth movements or youth
Mm-hmm.
culture, as you say, in the 1950s and 60s that actually generated another baby bust. So you talk about the rise of feminism and sexual liberation and so on. And the way you put it here is that the baby boom produced boomers who demanded new freedoms and opportunities, which in turn produced a baby bust. Now,
Yep.
the question I have, what was it exactly about these movements, these particular movements, that made the family, for instance, less important, which in turn meant couples were having less children, if at all?
Sure. You look at the areas where these changes had the greatest impact originally. That was originally in Scandinavia and Northern
Mm,
Europe. You got a great deal of sexual liberation, personal liberation. People defined their lives, their futures according to themselves and intimate units of couples, and children became sort of an optional add-on. And one interesting thing for me is the sheer speed with which that change happened, and just how rapidly societies like that came up with fertility rates that were historically close to unprecedented, very, very low. So I see it as partly, it's partly technology in terms of contraceptives. Contraceptives have been around for a while. There's a fundamental change of ideology in terms of how people are defining their role. And then you add something there, which is new kinds of economic pattern, which particularly allow women to be in the workplace. Women in the workplace do not want to generally have 4, 5, and 6 children. One, maybe two at a stretch, and particularly if they're living in cities. You combine urbanization, migration, the growth of service industries, and it's a fundamental shift in the role of women. So new societies emerge quite dramatically in the 1950s and 1960s, and these are societies that are not exactly rejecting children, but they have a much more limited ambition about the number of children they want to have.
So you're arguing that the decline of family led to the decline of church attendance, and can you explain that a bit more?
Right.
Because I wonder if the shift in attitudes towards faith contributed to reducing fertility, or did the decline in fertility undermine religious loyalties? You get what I mean? What comes first?
Yeah. You ask an excellent question, and in my book, I say on a good number of occasions, what I'm identifying is correlation, not causation. These two trends go together, and frankly, I find it very hard to say which comes first. And like I say, it's a very good question. And I can come up with a couple of theories. So I could, for example, say, ideologies change, people move away from religion and the extended family idea. They no longer have this commitment to posterity, to carrying on this continuity, and that results in lower fertility. You can also argue the other way around. Fertility declines. There are smaller families. People are detached from social institutions like schools and churches. If you look at villages where in the 1950s, they got maybe 100 children going through First Communion classes, by the 1970s, they've got 10. This is very different. But there's a basic problem in finding this, which is the two trends go together so closely in terms of time. It's very hard to tell. And the example I use a lot throughout the book is Italy, where in the 70s, and particularly the mid and late 1970s, the two changes, decline of institutional religion, decline of fertility, just go hand in hand in the space of 5 or 10 years. I don't even know how you would detect what is influencing what. I can see a parcel of trends. I can see the consequence. The exact causation is very tough, but you put your finger on an excellent issue in all these discussions.
Yeah, you also mentioned how low fertility societies can actually be quite hostile to institutional religion. Why do you think that is?
Think about it in terms of how religion, if you like, intrudes or makes a presence in people's lives. If, for example, you are in a society with a great many children and your kids are in First Communion classes or Bar Mitzvah classes or whatever the setup is, then you have a vested interest in belonging to those institutions. If you don't, if you separate from them, then you are much less prone to accept religious policies that interfere with your particular freedom, your individual rights, your rights to pursue, if you like, a hedonistic course. And you can map this change that I'm talking about by a series of debates, particularly in countries where, God bless them, they have referenda. So you have nice numbers to count, and you have referenda over things like, well, it's a sequence, divorce, contraception, which are relatively easy in lots of ways because these are consenting adult behaviors. And then to topics like abortion and same-sex marriage, which are much more controversial according to traditional religion. And as people become willing to run up against the church on these issues, so these referenda occur, the more the church presents itself as being fervently opposed to these reforms, the more unpopular they become. And there's also a lot of symbolic politics here, because the people who are making these conservative arguments are often older men, which is not a great way to win the support of younger women. So issues of age, gender, education all hit together. And when those women are also employed and educated, then the question arises, why on earth should I listen to these men?
Right. Yeah, right. So at this point in your narrative, in your book, you start talking about definitions of secularization. And this, I think, is the kind of the real meat of the issue. You know, the old kind of conventional interpretation is modernity advances, religion withdraws. That's the kind of common assumption. But then you also talk about the rise of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, that allegedly religiously unaffiliated. But the rise of the nuns sets a kind of limitation on the secularization thesis, right?
Sure.
Believing and belonging are not the same thing. Can you say a little bit more about the nuns?
Yes. Okay, where to start? There's a very fine British sociologist called Grace Davy, and her work really introduced this idea of believing and belonging. And people adhere to religion in different ways. They can believe the doctrine and they can belong to the institution, or they can believe without belonging. Over the last 25 years, we've heard a lot in surveys of people who, when asked about their religious affiliation, say, none, I'm not connected to a particular church, I don't belong. And some people will say, well, that means these are people who have rejected religion. These are atheists. They deny God. Not at all. The more you look at these people, particularly in the United States, you often find these are people who are believers in many ways. They may pray, they may even attend church. But the big issue is being prepared to say that they belong. So I try to be very careful when I talk about secularization. And what I'm talking about in the context of Europe is the very precipitous decline of organized institutional religion, which does not necessarily mean a rejection of religious belief as such. Now, for many people, it may. And the question then arises, and this is, I suppose the jury is still out on this. If you reject institutional religion, but you carry on believing, how long can you keep that balancing act up without the supporting role of other people in a congregation? Is it possible to remain a believer without belonging indefinitely? Can you do it for 5 years, 30 years, a generation? And what we're finding in Europe is that over a generation or so, those non-belongers tend to become non-believers. So there's a gap. Maybe it's not inevitable. But that's a very interesting process that is so very under-researched. If anyone wants to go write a book on that, there's a great one to be written.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of American sociologist Peter Berger, who wrote long ago that our modern situation, not so much secularization as much as pluralism. You have many different options, many different beliefs to pick from. So even as institutions fade, belief in God, at least in some form, is remarkably stubborn, right? So I guess the obvious next question is, what kind of God or gods are the nuns worshiping?
Right. And it very much depends on the society. In the United States, where the whole nun concept came into existence, the nuns are remarkably religious, please excuse the air quotes at that point, in that the religion they reject is a very traditional kind of religion. So they still identify in a very, very broad sense with Christianity or Judaism, but they're not prepared to make that formal identification. Many of them are, however, prepared to carry on with lots of religious practices. And in the context of Europe, you find people who will have nothing to do with religious institutions, but they're very enthusiastic devotees of pilgrimage, which is currently enjoying an enormous vogue across Europe. Somebody is going on these pilgrimages. Somebody is accounting for these millions of people going to the pilgrim shrines. And I suggest it's a great many people who, if you ask them what their religious affiliation is, they would say, none, don't believe in it.
Right, right. It's funny because I don't know if you've interacted with Tara Burton and her book Strange
Sure.
Rites, which was also published in 2020,
Yep.
and she calls the nuns the remixed.
Yep.
She argues the remixed seek this kind of satisfy this kind of deep need for meaning and purpose and community, but it's a rejection of institutional traditional religion. It's more of an intuitional faith.
And
so
let me just say,
yeah.
I'm a great admirer of that book, and I've written some pieces arising from it. But where she's so good is she takes so many of these traditional issues and pays really a serious attention to how they get transmuted by technology. And not just institutions going on the internet, but just how much of a religious career, religious thought world can be kept up online. And it's interesting, of course, she wrote that book before COVID sent so many people to try and sustain their church life online with varying degrees of success. So that's a book I treat very seriously.
Okay, yeah, I'm a big fan of it as well. So this privileging of the personal, the private, sort of the emotional experience over against the kind of public communal worship. What are its origins? Where does it come from?
It depends in what society. And if you think about it, in the United States, that is a doctrine that has been around for a great many years. I mean, if you look 100 years before the origins of the internet, people have a very individualistic attitude. They're quite often quite detached from institutional religion, and they have what really a cafeteria attitude expressed through various forms of what we would loosely call New Age religion. And I can map this for you from Transcendentalism onwards to the impact of Asian religions from the 1890s onwards. But these ideas have always been not so much outside the mainline churches, but they're the next door neighbors, maybe the slightly embarrassing next door neighbors that we don't talk about. But there's always feedback between the two. Ideally wish, that we had opinion surveys from 1900 asking people about whether they were nuns. And I'd love to see that, and it's totally impossible, so I can fantasize about it. But oh, brother, that would be such an interesting survey.
Right. What do you think of the argument? I think Berger has put this forward, and to some extent, Tara Burton as well, that it stems from kind of a Protestant context. The Protestantism in particular embraced sort of the legitimacy of choices, and she argues, Tara Burton argues in her book that the remixed are not the product of oppressive religious tradition, but most of them have grown up in mainline Protestant homes. What do you think of that argument?
I listen to the argument and I try and assess it as best I can, but I would also say that since the 1960s, one of the biggest trends in this country is how America's largest religious, one of America's largest traditions, Roman Catholics, quarter of the population, have been detached, unmoored from a very firm basis in the church institution. And many of them have become at least as experimental and individual as Protestants. I would actually argue that if you look at the number of nuns in this country, which has gone from like 5% to 25% over the last 15 or 20 years, probably about half of that is people saying that they're no longer prepared to describe themselves as Catholic. I think there's a direct highway from Catholic to liberal Catholic to nun. And the issue then is whether there's a return route there, and I'm not sure. So I'm fine with the word Protestant, provided it's a Protestantism that includes about some tens of millions of liberal Catholics.
Yeah. So moving towards the global south, as it were, you argue that in Latin America, in the last 40 years or so, is moving very sharply from a high fertility scenario to a low fertility scenario. We know, of course, this has been the case for Europe for a long time, but why is this happening in the South? Why is it happening in that context? What are the factors the same?
The factors are very similar. There's probably about a 25-year delay in this 30-year delay between Europe and Latin America. Still in the 1980s, people were writing books about population explosions in Latin America. They were talking about sky-high fertility rates in Mexico and Brazil and Colombia. In the 1990s, those basically stopped. And we went over to very European rates quite rapidly. I think the factors are very similar to Europe. And what are they? Economic shift, growth of service industries, growth of female employment. One very, very big one, growth of higher education for men and especially for women. Migration to cities, once again, it's very hard if you're hoping to have a decent apartment in a big city to have the 4 and 5 children there. But the outcome of this is some Latin American countries actually became like Denmark in a very short time. A country like Uruguay very soon became the oldest and least fertile area of the continent. And people said, well, that's just Uruguay. And then the same figures spread through Brazil, the hit countries like Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Chile. And you also got, much to the amazement of many North Americans, a secularization. I think it's very interesting that the practice of same-sex marriage was legal in several Latin American jurisdictions before it was in the United States. Yeah. And that was in the teeth of ferocious opposition from churches, Catholic and Protestants. There's a willingness to defy those in the name of secular ideologies of individualism, libertarianism. So, and by the way, I just wrote something on Argentina, which, much to our surprise, just legalized abortion. Very, very surprising in a country with notionally a very high number of Catholics.
Right. And in the next section, another section in your book, you talk about Asian cultures. You also mentioned this kind of moral revolution that obviously has affected religious beliefs in many ways. So in this case, it looks like declining religious beliefs or changes in moral beliefs has led to the decline in fertility rates. Is there anything particularly different in the context of Asian cultures? For instance, the first thing I think about, and we hear about this over and over again, that Eastern cultures are more communal, less individualistic than Western societies. Is the East becoming more and more like the West in that sense?
Yeah, the lowest fertility rates in the world now are very heavily East and Southeast Asian. So you're looking at Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. The more I look at this, the more I wonder whether we maybe exaggerated just how communal those standards were, and how easily they broke up when extreme rapid economic modernization and migration put people into these megacities, into businesses. And if you want to see this, where this goes, then pay attention to what happens in Japan, which is one of the lowest fertility, lowest faith societies in the world. And just look at the sheer lack of interaction. The number of people the number of men, for instance, who, when asked if they've had any contact of any kind with a girl in the previous 5 years, will say, to use the phrase, none.
Yeah.
And the atomization, the detachment from normal human interactions is extreme. There are now, by the way, whole enterprises in Japan where actors can be hired to act out families that you can rent for set times.
Right. I lived in South Korea for a year,
Sure.
where my wife and I were teaching English there. And one of the things that was very striking for us is that they had these families, but a lot of times they were separated. They were separated by cities. You know, they had like multiple apartments. They had an apartment where the wife worked, and they have an apartment where the husband worked, and it was a different city altogether. So it's almost like they're trying to hold on to this kind of communal family tradition.
Good.
But in the kind of economic situation they're currently living in, it's very hard to. They wouldn't see each other for weeks, but then maybe they would have a break over the weekend, and they would come together as a family. But so there's a separation is going on. Is that something you were just talking about Japan? Is that something similar from
very much so? And then, of course, you take what you just said and think through the consequences for religion. Think of a society where so much religious expression is a communal or family thing. And also ask yourself the question, people living in a society like that, how much free leisure time do they actually have? And you realize how much of what religious structures did in the past was sustained by the unpaid labor of women who did not have other things to do. Suddenly they do. So you've taken out so much the labor force that keeps churches and temples going.
Right, and the Middle East in your book is a little trickier, right? I see that there's kind of pushback against this kind of modernization. What's happening in the Middle East? Because you do argue that it is secularization, and infertility is something that's growing, but then there's also a lot of pushback coming from the Middle East as well.
I use the phrase a two-tier Islamic world. And before you say it, you know, Islam is not just the Middle East, but that is true. And there are some countries in the Islamic world, above all Iran, which have moved so rapidly to becoming low fertility, low faith societies. It's almost amazing. I mean, Iran's fertility rate has gone from basically about 6 or 7 children per woman in the 1980s to about 1.7 today. That's incredible. There are countries that are below Denmark in that way. And also, yes, they've secularized. You may not look at Iran and think a secular society. The government's not secular, but a whole lot of the people are. And a lot of the survey evidence makes them sound like, well, New England. They really sound very secular. And I can point to some countries like that. There are other countries that are very traditional, conservative, high fertility, high faith. Egypt is an example. Pakistan is an example. And any generalizations that we make about the Islamic world in this way, oh, they're all countries of, fanatical religious extremism. Well, some are, some are not. And that has a lot of implications. It has implications for religious change. If you're a very low fertility society, you need people to do the jobs and pay the taxes. That means immigrants. And those immigrants have a bad habit of belonging to some other religion. Christians brought in immigrants who were in Europe who were Muslim. The Arab Gulf brought in immigrants who are Christian. So religious diversity naturally follows. And the really interesting country to follow over the next decade or so is Saudi Arabia, which has now moved to becoming a low fertility society. Is it possible to keep up a traditional society in terms of the role of women, restraints on women, required religious discipline in a society where traditional family structures don't work in anything like the same way? And before you say it's a rhetorical question, I have not an idea.
Yeah, right. It kind of brings us to this question that you have at the end of the book, kind of a provocative question. How can religions cope with this demographic revolution? This is kind of a new global phenomenon that is utterly different from most of human history. All religions of the world will have to face these statistical consequences, and does that spell the end of faith in a way?
Right. If churches or religious institutions are not paying very close attention to this, they're making a huge mistake. There are things they can do, and they can look at what they've always done, which is orient themselves heavily to nuclear families, to children, to youth programs, and realize that for many institutions, that game is up, at least for the foreseeable future. They need to think how to take care not just of their older members, but their really older members. But the trends I'm talking about are not equally distributed across the globe. And as in the Arab Gulf, bringing in lots of very kind of enthusiastic Christians from India and the Philippines, there are some areas in the world that are still high faith, high fertility, will continue to be so at least for a generation and maybe much longer. And those people will be emigrating. So it might be that if you take, I don't know, Denmark or the Netherlands, in 30 years, these will be very religious societies, but the religion will not be the preserve of Danes or Dutch people, but of African people or Middle Eastern immigrants. So I don't think the issue is necessarily religion as such. It's the kind of religion, the kind of traditional religion, and the assumption that you have people who live in families, in communities, there's this long-term stability, and they go to church or whatever institution on a Sunday. That world is fading away, but it does not mean that religious institutions or religious practice are fading away. And it's an interesting idea. Can a religious institution stop being an institution in anything like the way it's always been and devise new ways of reaching, responding to the needs of a wholly new public? We know corporations can do this. Some do, some don't. Can churches? And can churches do that if that means really breaking away from some of their older attitudes about morality, gender, sexuality? And once again, I'm very happy with my lot, which is I am a professor, I'm not a prophet, so I do not have to make these decisions myself.
Right. Religion is not going away anytime soon, but there is a transformation coming in many ways. So we are asking all our guests how their disciplinary or methodological approach contributes to our understanding, in this case, of faith, fertility, and secularization. Could you share with us your approach in the book? It's different because it's focusing so much on kind of statistical data, but the approach that you took in the book, the sources you used. How did you go about researching this book?
Sure. Maybe the first thing I would say is that the evidence, the kind of basic data I'm using, you could say they're hiding in plain sight, but they're not even hiding. They're so incredibly easy to find. The United Nations has excellent data on fertility. Individual countries have some more speculative than others. There are some fairly closed societies, but you can make reasonable deductions. Religion, of course, is a very tough one. You have to decide exactly how you're going to define what you're looking for. You have to make it very clear when you're looking at attitudes as opposed to behavior. But again, so much of this is so easy. I mean, there's a wonderful thing called the European Values Survey, which has been going for many years. It allows you to track changes in people's attitudes. You have the Pew studies in the United States and also in other areas. At every point, of course, there are questions that you have to ask yourself. How are you defining this? How are you finding that information? So you have to be aware, but the information is not difficult to get hold of. And the other thing you have to do is apply a knowledge of history. And if, for example, you are going to make a claim that we have this fact and this fact, then you really need to have the background knowledge to look at it and say, well, hang on, there's a problem there. That was also true in 1880, and that had totally different consequences. Why is that? So a historical context is also essential. But as I say, the data themselves are honestly not that tough to deal with. This is not some kind of huge numbers crunching operation.
Most of it's online too now. I mean, there are online databases that you can. You don't have to go into the archives, especially in the situation we're in right now. But you could just go online and have access to it. So,
and in terms of the quick and dirty, there's a wonderful resource called the CIA Fact Book. Which has all sorts of materials about religion and demographics. One interesting thing about that, you actually can play a game there, which is you can take a couple of the main resources that are online, look at a particular country or area and what they say about religion, and look at the range of estimates they give you. And I'm just, making this up, but they may say, oh, in this country, 20% of the people are Catholic, and the other one says 60%, and the other one says 90%, and that, sends off flares. And let's figure out how they're asking these questions. And that's put it like this: being a lifelong skeptic helps enormously in assessing these figures.
Right. So you've written on a lot of topics. What is your next project? What would you like to work on next?
Well, I actually just have a new book out, which actually relates quite closely to the Fertility and Faith one, and it's on how climate change drives religious revolutions. It's called Climate, Catastrophe, and Faith. And the reason I say it relates to the fertility one is the highest fertility areas of the world are also the most religious. And they're also the ones that are most directly and acutely exposed to very harmful climate change. How will they respond to this if you have societies like the Sahel, or North or Central Africa or the Great Lakes of Africa, and the situation becomes unlivable? You have these hundreds of millions of people. What happens to them? And well, the answer is a lot of them will migrate, And will
Yeah.
they take their religious ideas with them? Probably. Will they evolve new religious ideas as they go? Well, a lot of historical change, a historical example, suggests that's what happens to people during climate changes. They evolve new religions.
Yeah. So you've already written this book, or you want to write?
Yeah. This just came out.
Okay. Well, I'll have to definitely look it up. We'll put it in the link in a box under the YouTube
All
video.
right.
So with that, Professor Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us today and for your contribution. And we definitely look forward to that next book of yours.
Thank you very much for your hospitality.